Just a reminder before we get started, if you like the content you see here and you want to see the entire mini course, you can gain access to this for free over on Skillshare by using the link in the description down below. That will give you a 1 month free trial of the premium membership and gain you immediate access to the full third-person platformer controller mini course topic over on Skillshare. Otherwise, the content will continue to upload weekly here in attempts to please the YouTube algorithm and keep the content flowing. Now that we have our axis mappings added to the project, this is pretty much where we're going to leave these. So in fact, we can create a comment around these, and if we come back and extend them later, we'll know where to look. So after grabbing everything here, we just need to press C. That will give us a comment, and we'll just say that this is the movement logic. You can customize your comments if you wanted to. I tend to just make the boxes darker, the text stands out, and then make the text a little bit bigger so we can see it from a further distance. And a similar thing for the looking logic. With those done, this is nicely housed away at the top of the input graph, so I'll just leave things here. Again, I know that that's pretty much all we're going to need for the movement and the looking. So we can now move on to our action mappings, those binary events looking for either being pressed or released. We'll start with a very simple one, which is going to be jumping, because again, Unreal has an entire system built in for handling jumps. Now we will be doing some of our own custom logic building upon this a little bit later, but I did want to show you one thing to keep in mind is that I'm purposely going through and we'll be adding the very basic implementations, some of which I would class as being perhaps not necessarily the wrong way to do things, but definitely the less flexible. And I wanted to show you the results that we get from taking this approach and then how we fix them. So if you're ever working in your own project, I want you to know not just how to follow these steps, but also to understand what's happening and how you can improve upon some of the features which are lacking. So if we first of all find our jump binding, this is going to be a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of different things called jump. You've got the event on jumped, which is an event which is tracked obviously when someone has jumped. We've got the jump function, which is what we'll be calling later, a check to see if a jump is available, which I'll explain why that exists also later, and a few other things around that. But basically, we're looking for our action mapping or our action event. So that's the thing that we've created in our project settings for the input. And you can see we have a pressed and a released option. From here, what we want to do is call the jump function that I've just mentioned. So again, we'll find jump and we can see we've got a couple of less options now and a couple of variables which are popping up as well. So again, these will be relevant in just a moment. But just to begin, if we find the jump function and we'll call this, that is how you make a character jump in Unreal. Nice and simple. If we come in, press play, then we have a jump function. So there wasn't too much to that, but like I've said, this does come with some restrictions, and we will be making essentially our own version of this a little bit later, but I wanted to get a little bit more in depth to show you just how far you can take this, because this may be perfectly fine for some projects, and also some considerations if you are going to use the built-in jump function, considerations to know about what you'll have to do to make it work properly. Now, the first thing that you do have to do to make this work properly is when you release this, you also want to call the stop jump function. So we're going to call stop jumping, and this just lets the character class know that the requirement for the jump functionality has been released. And the reason for this is if we go on to the player node here and we look for our jump details, we've got a couple of things we can see under the character category. The first one is the maximum jump hold time. Now this relates to something which is often referred to as variable jump heights. You'll see it in games like Mario, where if you tap jump, you go up for just like half a second or something. If you hold jump, then you get a much bigger arc, and it can last almost until you release or until Mario reaches the peak of his jump. Now, the way that this is calculated is that when you press something, this is going to keep running and applying force until something notifies that this should stop. Usually that's going to be that you've reached the peak of your height or that the button has been released. So if we look at this now and try this, it's not going to look any different. We don't have that variable jump height. Even if we hold it or tap it, we haven't told it to have any maximum time that we can hold this. So I'm going to set this to something a little bit extreme. Let's say 3 seconds. This is way higher than you would ever set a variable jump height. But we'll press play. And if I hold this for 3 seconds now, it's almost like I have the power of flight. But if I were to come in and tap this, then we can see that we land almost immediately, or not land immediately, but it stops, because that stops calculating as soon as this is called. Now, if we remove this and we press play, this I've now let go, but I'm still flying because it's going to reach that peak because nothing's told it to stop this jumping function. Okay, so this is why it's important. If you're not rolling your own jumping logic, this will be doing things under the hood based on some of the values that we have just here. So we want to account for this. Now, I think I will use this for the variable part of the basic jump. I'm going to set this to something more realistic, like maybe 0.3, 0.5. You can see if we can get some variable jumps going on. So that's a tap, and this is holding it. So that feels okay. It doesn't feel okay because the gravity is disgusting. And this is another problem with the default character class, is when people don't account for that we're using a 1 times gravity force on a mass that may not quite relate. And it makes things feel a little bit floaty. We're in the air for a bit too long. It kind of feels like we're floating or hovering down. So that's something else we're going to improve on the polish pass, but just something to keep in mind. So when I say it feels good, I mean that it feels as though we are getting a variable jump height. I think the gravity still needs to be changed. Now, the other thing about the jump function I wanted to mention is we have this jump count. So as you might expect, if we set this to something like 2 or 3, we can get a double or a triple jump, and you can send this as high as you wanted. Now, this also has some limiting features. The main thing, as a brief overview, when we get to adding the wall jumps, because this is all calculated and tracked internally, the maximum jump count doesn't get reset until a function, which is built in. We can find the onLanded function. So until this is called, the jump count that we have here doesn't get reset. And unfortunately, for some reason, we don't have access to override this variable. So we can get to the current jump count and we can change the maximum jump count here, but we cannot set the current jump count. Ideally, what we'd be able to do is set the variable ourselves. But what this means is that if in some games, if you remember, like you can do a jump into a double jump into a wall jump, and then you can keep wall jumping. Or if you've only jumped once, you can do a wall jump, and then you still have your double jump retaining when you leave, so you can get a little bit of distance after that wall jump. Unfortunately, that doesn't work here because it doesn't get reset unless you literally meet the criteria of landing, which is checking a surface in the Z velocity below where you are. And obviously walls generally don't count as landing, which means this won't be called. So this is one of the limiting features of using the jump and the inbuilt double jump system, which is why by the end of this content, we will be rolling our own version. But again, I wanted to make sure that we cover the basic implementation so you can see what you might come up against. So we're going to leave this for now. I would recommend adding in a double or triple jump, and you can try adding in 5 or 6 or however many you want, and you will jump until you reach that cap. For testing, it's going to be easier to test this with a double jump so that we can see exactly when this is called and how this gets reset. Remember, this isn't just about getting to the end of a really polished way of implementing the character. I wanted to show you around how the character movement component and the class itself is working, so you're more familiar with those limitations, how to work around them, and what it provides, because it still provides a lot of really useful functionality. So that's jumping, and we're going to leave that here for now. We will be doing something with this a bit later, so maybe we can keep the on event landed. This won't be doing anything right now, but we will need it in the future. What we're going to move on to is our walking and sprinting. So this is very simple. We've already seen that we have the character movement component tracking the walking speed that we have. All we really want to do is when we either have the walk button or the sprint button pressed, we want to change what our maximum movement speed is. What we'll do first of all is we'll find our walking input binding. So that's our action event. And we will get the character movement component. So like with any other component, we're going to control drag this in. We will set the movement speed, which is our maximum walk speed. And we can actually set these values as well as getting them just here. So we're going to set the max walk speed. This will be problematic. You can probably see that I've missed a step of the logic here. If not, then again, this is why I'm doing it this way first. What we're going to do is we're going to directly multiply this. So we'll multiply this by, let's say, half of the current walk speed. And of course, again, we can do that by pulling from the character movement component. I just press Control W to copy the component. Control W copies and pastes in one go. We're going to get the max walk speed. And we're going to plug this in here. So whatever the maximum walk speed is, we're going to half that, and that will be our new speed when we have the walk button pressed. So if we come in and press play, We won't do anything just yet. Remember, I have this set to control, so I'm going to press control, and you can see we slow down. When I release this, we're not going to go back up because we haven't done that half. But the problem is that if we press control again, we're going to half that again, we're going to half it again, and we're essentially just going to keep halving it until we can barely move. So what we want to do, we don't want to affect this directly. We want to come into the event begin play. In fact, we can cut this. We're not going to plug that in just here. So we'll cut that from here. I'm going to paste this back in, and I'm going to promote this to a variable. I'm going to call this one default walk speed. And we're going to plug this in to the begin play. So now when we start playing, we're going to keep track of what this was set to before we've touched anything, before anything has been overridden or affected. Then on our input graph, we're going to move this a little bit. We're going to need a little bit more space because we're going to set the walk speed to be half of what the default walk speed was. So we know that we have the default walk speed set to 600 because that's what we have here. So on begin play, it's going to grab this value. We're going to set the current walk speed to half of that. And the really important thing, of course, is that when we release the key, we're going to plug this in and we're going to make this return to default walk speed. So nice and simple. Hopefully that makes sense. So again, if we try this one now, we can come in, we can move around as normal, hold control. We can see we slow down a bit, let go, and we go back to our normal speed. A little bit hard to see perhaps, but I think having these pillars here gives us a good kind of reference of how fast we were moving past them. So that is the walking, and you can probably imagine that sprinting is going to be very, very similar. So we'll start by getting our sprint action event, and in fact, I'm just going to copy pretty much all of this and plug this in just over here. What you might want to do is promote this to a variable as well. So we'll promote this down here. And I'll name this one walk speed offset. Just to keep this nice and clear of what's happening, maybe that isn't too easy to read. So we're multiplying our default speed by our walk speed offset. We're essentially halving the default speed. And in a similar way, what we're going to do is I'll promote this to another variable. I'll change it first of all. And just in case you're not aware, when you promote a variable that already had a value plugged in, that will automatically be applied to the variable you've created. So walk speed offset is automatically 0.5. Now I know from testing that I want the sprint speed not to just be double, but I want it to be 2.5 the default walk speed because this plugs in quite nicely to how I'm going to set up the animations a little bit later. So I'm going to promote this to a variable when it's set to 2.5, and I'm going to call this one sprint speed offset. So the main reason for this is it just avoids us having those what are referred to as magic numbers, just variables that don't really have any context. Outside of being plugged in, you'd need to double check what it's all doing to get an idea. Whereas this time we know that we're multiplying the default walk speed by the sprint speed offset to get a value return. So it just makes a little bit more sense when reading it back. And it also means we can very easily and quickly change this. So we don't need to jump into the event graph. I can just grab this over here, change this if I wanted to increase it or reduce it. And it's just easier to maintain your code when you turn things into variables when there's that option. So this will work again. We know that's pretty much going to work immediately. So we're going to come in and we can now sprint. So we're getting that 2.5 times speed. We let go. We're going back to normal speed. So sprinting and walking, also very easy to implement. And these pretty much as in-depth as we need to go. So I'm going to create a comment around these and we'll just call this the movement speed offsets. And in fact, I've just added a kind of post note there saying that this is to do specifically with the sprinting and walking. So again, it's very easy to find where these are in the input graph. Now, something I've mentioned a few times is to do with the speed at which the character's moving. I've really only touched on the movement speed for walking. We also have crouching, which if we were to do a simple test with, let's just hard code in an input here for input key C. So if we type key C, we'll get this, which is a very kind of standard crouch button. And what we can do, again, there is built-in functionality for crouching, so we can just search for crouch. And like with jumping, we want to track this so that when we release the button, we uncrouch. Now, I don't have anything in the project specifically for crouching, but this is the functionality you can make use of. And what I wanted to mention are a few things that this will do. So if we press play and press C and try to do this, we'll see that nothing happens by default. Now, the first thing we want to do is grab our character movement component, look for the crouch category here, and enable this as a movement capability. So we're going to tick the can crouch, come back in, and we'll see there's a pretty horrible snap that we get from crouching. What has happened is if we come in, press the capsule component, and we're going to set this to be visible. So we're going to find the rendering options, untick this from being hidden in game, which basically means we'll see the capsule collider. And what is happening is when we press C, this is being halved. So we've got something called a crouching half height. So if we type crouch again, we can see we have a crouching half height. And this basically means the size in which the capsule is going to be set to whilst crouching. We also have a default speed for crouching, which is half of the walking speed. So two things happen here. The capsule gets shrunk, which is why the camera snaps down, which feels quite horrible. So if you're implementing this in your own game, you're going to want to apply a lerp or something to ease that camera offset. And then you can see the movement speed is slower as well. So crouching is also accounted for. Obviously, the idea of the capsule going down is you can now crawl under different surfaces. But like I said, you do get that kind of uncomfortable snap because it's so quick. Now, one easy way that we can offset this, because we have a spring arm, is we can come in, and in Unreal 5 you get this weird thing where all of the values collapse if you were searching for something. So click off, click back on, and everything's collapsed back down. We want to get the spring arm, and we want to apply a camera lag, and we'll press play. And this is a nice simple way to kind of ease that animation of the camera going down with the capsule half height. And that's just because it's the spring arm's connected based on the height of the capsule. So that's crouching. Like I said, we're not going to fully implement that in the project, but I wanted to at least cover it slightly. So I'm just going to, we generally don't hard code inputs, so I'm going to remove these. But that is how you change the movement speed and things if you wanted to use crouching. Make sure that can crouch is enabled. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that we've touched on the walking speed quite a lot, but we also have different options that the character can take. So I'd recommend just reading through all of this when you get the chance, looking at the different things which are being accounted for in the movement component. So we've got our walking category, which is what we've been using so far. But you'll see that you also have things for jumping and falling, which is where the default velocity comes in. So we could double this, or roughly double this, and we'll get a double jump height. So we're now controlling how high we jump based on this value here. So we've got loads of things that we can do for jumping. I'm going to set this back down, and we'll come back and play around with these again in the polish phase. But it's going to be nice to keep these default to see again why I would think, and I think a lot of people agree with this, why the default character movement that you see with the Manny the mannequin is generally just looks a little bit sloppy, and it really kind of shows that a new person might have come up with that project and left the default settings, not knowing what to change. So we're going to leave this so we can have a nice comparison at the end of the content. But then on top of this, you have other options as well. So you've got the movement type of swimming and the movement type of flying, which is really cool, which means what you can actually do up here is we can change the default land movement from walking to something like flying, which will actually disable gravity. So if we now come over here, it feels very floaty. So I let go and I'm still kind of floating along because the friction's reduced. And you can see there's no gravity. So if I were to put this back to walking, although we haven't seen it before, you would expect the character to fall off the edge like so because gravity is automatically enabled. And another thing to note with gravity as well, which is quite important, is that is enabled on the character movement. So the gravity scale of 1 is what is controlling that. So if we set this to 0, then that will let us kind of float off into the distance as well. Okay. Again, what a lot of people will assume is because the root component is the capsule component, they'll assume that the gravity is enabled here, and it actually isn't. The physics isn't simulated on the capsule. And if we did simulate physics, we then get like a weird battle of movement and nothing happens. You can't move at all because the gravity force is too high on the capsule component. And then what you do get is the chance that this is going to start rolling over. If there are forces applied, then the capsule is going to roll over and be pushed around. So do keep that in mind as well. Untick the simulate physics, go back into the character movement. One other thing that we can look at, the other values. So if we change this to swimming rather than flying, then of course this is going to change the movement speeds that we have. So swimming is like very sticky and has a much slower acceleration and also much harder to turn around in things. And if we wanted to affect that, if we change the movement mode, then of course you need to remember to come down and change the maximum swimming speed and the values assigned to that. And these are also things that we can change at runtime. So what you'd normally do if you were entering some water, you would change the movement mode from the character movement component. So you can set the movement mode to be from one of those enumerators that you want. So when you enter water, you're going to change it to swimming. When you leave, you're going to change it back to walking. If you have a flying option, then you can change it to flying. So again, the character movement component has a lot of different options that you can make use of as long as you know they're there. So that's why I'd recommend just taking a look through. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're making more of a character for platforming, like a third-person character or a 3D platformer. But there are a lot of things that you can do here, so it will be useful to know about them. Hopefully you've enjoyed that content, and just a reminder, if you wanted to get access to the full topics in this mini course, it's already fully available and uploaded over on Skillshare. I'm providing links in the description down below, which will allow you to sign up with a free premium trial. You'll gain full access to all of the courses over on Skillshare, including this 3D platformer focused controller topic. So be sure to check that out if you wanted to take advantage of the offer whilst it lasts. And as always, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of the people supporting all of the work that I do here on YouTube, allowing me to keep making this weekly content. So a big thank you to all of the names scrolling down the screen.